Nice to have you all here. This is the second class of this 7-week course on contemporary theology, in which I try to summarize for you in an efficient way what's going on in this whole world of theology. And in the first class, I tried to establish what I like to call a religious position. I tried to talk about us human beings as spiritual-type creatures, so that as we look at our common human experience, we begin to find what our dimension I like to call the depth dimension of life. So we find ourselves oriented to mystery. That when we probe a bit beneath the surface, we come up against things that are not easily analyzed, that sort of defy any sort of rational, logical calculation. And I like to speak of that about as being immersed in a world of mystery. And that it's important to come to terms with that. One of the ways I tried to analyze that was in terms of our human loving and our freedom and our will and all of the kinds of problems that emerge as we try to analyze that in any kind of greater depth. In doing so, I'm taking the first steps in the enterprise we know as theology. Theology, as I like to understand, is an attempt to make sense out of our common experience, to look at what we go through in life from the perspective of a given religious tradition. One way of thinking of theology is as an attempt to mediate between the meanings we find in our culture and the world as a whole and the meanings that we find in our Christian tradition. Now, what I tried to do, therefore, is then looking at our lives in that way to suggest that it was inadequate to think of life just as sort of a bundle of responses to stimuli. That's how B.F. Skinner liked to speak about us humans, as people who were responding to the stimuli of life and nothing more than that, sort of analyzed in physical, material terms. Skinner said that it didn't make any sense to talk about freedom in life, and that would just divert us from the real task of programming our existence. Okay, now tonight I want to go on and try to establish what I would call a theistic position. Now I want to talk a little bit about that mystery dimension of life and see why it is that some people don't come to terms with it, why some people have ruled it out, and why some people say that that doesn't make any sense at all. I want to talk about the problem of faith and our belief in God, talk a bit about our images of God. And I'm going to do it following very carefully on the syllabus. If anyone doesn't have a syllabus, there should be some back on the chair. They're sort of indispensable to following the lecture here, and saves you getting writer's cramp and so on. So if any of the newcomers who come in don't have a syllabus, they're back on that chair, and you'd be well advised to have one as I go along here and deal with the second class. Now, you know, it's no secret that faith is under attack today. You know, we meet a lot of people who publicly espouse atheism and say that that's a proper way of looking at life and so on. We find many individuals struggling with this. I was just talking to a person recently telling me that, you know, I just did a sharp experience of doubt. Just sort of took this person over. Just out of the blue, been a believer all the time, and just suddenly, on one given evening, came this massive surge of doubt. I wonder if this whole structure of religion that I've bought into makes any sense at all. Now, for many of us, the experiences aren't quite that sharp or intense, but many people in life, especially in the contemporary world, begin to have this kind of problem. Now, let me detail this in a particular way. Let's take an example of a young man from Delphos, Ohio, who grew up in a Catholic environment there. He had all Catholic friends. He went to a Catholic school. Everything in his life supported his faith. He really never encountered any atheists in his life. In fact, he really never encountered any people who were different at all. Didn't know any Jewish people, didn't know any black people. Really, his existence was very circumscribed, and everything about his life reinforced the faith. It's said that that's just the way you live. That's how it is as a believer, holding that God indeed does exist and is in rule over our lives. Now, this young man from Delphos, Ohio, graduates, and he comes here to the campus of the University of Toledo. And as he's going around this campus, new experiences begin to jump out at him. And so he meets this nice young lady, and he's going out with her, and she seems like a terrific person, and so very kind and charitable. And as he's going along, he finds out that she's an atheist. And that blows his mind, because his stereotypical notion of that was that an atheist would somehow be a bad person or have poor morals. And he really doesn't know what to make out of that. He has a Jewish roommate who's a fine, upstanding person and practices the Jewish religion and even likes to talk about his religion to him. And he begins to have some questions as a result of that. He goes to class and he runs into a graduate student in a philosophy class who speaks very glibly about the outmoded character of faith and belief and how the modern philosophers say that's all a bunch of baloney and so on. In fact, there's a whole attitude that sort of is supercilious towards belief, that puts it down as being childlike, like, well, as soon as you grow up, you'll see the light and be like the rest of us adults around here who have put aside all this belief in God. And then he also has a group of friends who are very different. They begin to challenge him from another side, and they go to these Bible meetings regularly, and they read the Word, and they tell him, you know, that religion that you had is no good. They didn't teach you about Jesus Christ. They didn't give you the Word. They didn't really nourish you as they should have. And therefore, all that thing that you grew up with is somehow deficient. In fact, you really aren't a Christian person unless you are like us, converted and speak in tongues and read the Scriptures each day and so on. And that begins to sow some doubts in his head. And finally, he reads in a paper about this transcendental meditation, and he goes to a lecture which they're talking about this as a form of spiritual discipline. And again, that begins to somehow or other relativize his faith. And before long, he's knocking on my door and saying, Father, you know, I'm so confused, I don't know what's happening. I used to have it all together, and it's fallen apart for me. I really don't know what to make out of this anymore, and I think I'm losing my faith. So I have to talk to this young man now about it and try to analyze for him something of what I think is going on, because he's simply part of the whole modern movement that the sociologists have identified as secularization, process in which many areas of our lives begin to have their own autonomy, in which people begin to think for themselves in the economic sphere, the sphere of psychology, the sphere of politics, all the various areas of life. People are beginning to say, hey, we don't need faith, you don't need God to do all those things. You have to think for yourselves along those lines. And really this belief is simply sort of a burden that keeps you from doing that well. I tell the young man that he's in what I like to call a supermarket situation now, that he's walking down the aisle of life in a way, and here's all of these products around. There are now viable options, ways in which one can live. He's encountering the fact that there is a pluralism of worldviews, of philosophies, of theologies, and which tends to relativize his own particular position. And as he walks down that supermarket aisle, he's just joining the human race, so to speak. He's doing something that is sort of unavoidable, at least in the modern, educated, urban world that a lot of us know. And so I try to tell the young man how to look at his experience as though it really isn't all that strange or unique, and really people have sort of put a name on all of that. You know, the plausibility structure is breaking down for him, as the sociologists say. You know, the sacred canopy, the umbrella that used to hold together all of life, a sort of homogeneous grouping where all areas of our life fit together and made it all make sense, that is now breaking down. Things are going out from underneath the sacred canopy and have their own autonomy. So, an analysis for him of what's going on. Now, how do I try to respond to him? Well, the first thing I want to say is that this secularization process is fundamentally a good thing. In fact, in many ways, it is inspired by Christianity itself. Christianity reminds us that we're supposed to think for ourselves. It tells us that, indeed, the political and economic realm, all the secular areas of our life do have their own autonomy and their own rules of logic, and that we have to be attuned to them in one way or another. I try to tell them that being in the supermarket is not only unavoidable, but potentially a good thing. Because what it forces is an adult decision about the faith. Rather than saying, hey, you better get back to Dulles, Ohio, where it's safe. No, I don't say that to them. I say, no, you better stay here and work your way through it. You have a great opportunity now to study, to learn, to improve your understanding of your own tradition, to encounter other viewpoints, to enter into dialogue that's often interesting and exciting. And you have the chance to do what Christianity says we have to do, that is appropriate the religion freely as an adult. The problem is, in previous generations, it seemed easy to go along without ever doing that. Other options were not viable. You know, it really wasn't, in my day, really feasible to become a Hindu through transcendental meditation. You never heard of it at that age. I never talked to a Buddhist at that time. No, those options were not live, theoretically possible, but not actually present viable options for us. And I'm trying to tell them that in a new situation is a good thing, because you won't be able to just drift. You won't be able to just go through life and accept the faith because your parents said that's the way it is. Accept it as a folk religion that's unthought through. And I suggest instead that now you've got a golden chance to really try to make this your own, appropriate it as an adult. And then I would have to try to argue for a theistic position, for saying that indeed we are immersed in mystery, and that that mystery can be trusted, and that the mystery even addresses us personally. That's, of course, what theism says in one way or another, that the mystery that surrounds us, that we can't get a hold of, is indeed gracious, that we can enter into dialogue with it, that we can talk to that mystery, and that when we die, we can commend ourselves to that mystery as though we will fall into gracious hands. So I try to tell them that that theistic position makes more sense, and I'll probably argue it on pragmatic grounds. That it seems to me that it has the greatest power to help us to do two main things. One, understand the deepest problems of life, what love and freedom are all about, and how we are to handle death and suffering. I suggest that it is the greatest help in dealing with those deep questions. And secondly, that it helps us to live more nobly and more responsibly, that it calls us forth to a greater maturity. Now, that is not what we call an apodictic argument. It's not a conclusive one. It's not like 2 plus 2 is 4. I'm not going to sit down with this young man from Delphus and somehow convince him that there's a God. He can't bring his friend into my room and say, hey, see, this priest, he's got a Ph.D. from Oxford. He's going to explain this all to you and argue this and convince you that indeed God exists. And I have to sit there and say, I can't do that. It doesn't admit of that kind of proof. It's possible to try to vindicate a theistic position, that is, say it's not foolish, not childish, not infantile, and it has potential pragmatically to help us live better and understand life better. I can argue it on those grounds. I can put it sort of simply, like what's going to help you most when your mother dies to deal with that kind of problem? Well, what's going to help you when you're really down in the pit to rise above that? How are you going to deal with despair and desolation in your life? And how are you going to find a way to thank who's ever running this world when things are going good? When things are going good and you sort of in your heart breathe out, thank you, who are you saying it to? Who are you addressing with that thank you? So I'm trying to suggest that the deepest experiences of life best are answered or seen in the light of that theistic position. Not that atheists can't live well, and not that atheists can't die well. You don't want to argue too much or claim too much. My claim is that it tilts towards theism, The probabilities move in that direction, it seems to me, as we try to carry forth this analysis. So, I want to respond to the young man positively. I want to say, in my mind, God is not one who's waiting up there for theoretical proof that he exists. God isn't some sort of being who's testing us in that way. But in this viewpoint, God is the one who enhances our freedom. God is the name we give to the mystery that is indeed kind and gracious and calls us to freely respond to the call. Calls upon us to appropriate the faith that we grew up in. Well, the greatest theologian of the 20th century and probably modern times, Karl Rahner, I like to call him Uncle Carl, you know. Uncle Carl says, indeed, he was asked one time why he's a Christian. And this is one of the famous articles he wrote. And he answered it not in highfalutin terms or anything like that, but just on the basis of what I was using before. He says, well, I'm a Christian because I haven't found anything better. That's surprising. And he says, yeah, I haven't found anything better to do those two things. Help me understand life better, its deepest questions, and to help me live more responsibly and nobly. If I found something better, I'd adopt it, but I haven't. I remember being on a TV panel show with a sparring partner of Muhammad Ali, who was sort of a born-again Christian type. And it was a call-in show, as I remember it, and I answered the question about why are you a Catholic, why are you a Catholic priest, and why are you a Christian, much in that way. He really took offense at it. I was afraid I was going to get punched out right then, because he wanted a stronger answer from a clergyman. And yet I believe that it really fits the facts and fits the kind of situation in which we find ourselves. So, first kind of problem here, therefore, is this secularization difficulty, and I want to respond in that positive kind of way. It gives us a chance to improve our image of God and appropriate the faith in an adult way. Now, as I usually do, I want to take a few minutes now and ask you to turn to the person next to you and just talk for a minute about what you got out of what I said. Try to pick up something positive. Instead of saying, boy, that was dumb, or I didn't get anything out of that, try to be positive and say, I like this, or I understood that, or that's helpful. Why don't we take a minute or so to do that? You might introduce yourself to the person next to you. Yes?
Well, that's the question I would have, and I probably should know the answer, but I would like a definition of secularization.
The question is asked about a definition of secularization. I often borrow that from the world of sociology. And I think what it fundamentally means is that various areas of modern life assume their own autonomy vis-a-vis religion and the church. It's a process going on in the 19th, 20th century, especially in the Western world, in which areas, as I said, like economics and politics and family life even, gradually assume their own logic. In other words, people in those areas are no longer saying, what does the church say about this? No, or what is my pastor telling me about how to act in my own family? No, what word do we hear about how to deal with economic problems? So these things assume their own autonomy. It's often talked about when they use the word secularization as though it naturally flows into atheism. That has been sort of one outlook on it. Like as we move forward in the modern world, we would gradually become more and more atheistic. In fact, in the 60s, the theologians talked like this. They talked about the death of God, as though the secularization process was just going forward, and as it was moving forward, there'd be no believers around before long. It'd just be a shrinking number of people. And the surprising thing that we saw in the late 60s and the 70s, of course, was this revival of religious interest right in the most secularized places. So in people who were very enlightened and had gone through all of this process suddenly found themselves rediscovering religious things. And I think the reason is because human beings are inherently religious. And you can tamp it all down, put the lid on it, try to create secularized people, but that religious urge will eventually break out. That's why I think we'll have a religious revival in China someday. And maybe there's the harbingers of that already. Listening to a man lecture on who was in China suggesting that. So that no matter how one would educate people in a secular way, the religious impulse seems to break out. And many of those death of God theologians said, hey, back to the drawing board. No, we really blew it. So it's not necessarily connected with atheism. It is a sociological process that can be identified in which various areas are taken out from under the sacred canopy of the church. Something we saw with the French Revolution and industrialization. Freud and Nietzsche and all those people. Yes? Mm-hmm. Yes, the word secular simply means world. Right, the secular priests are the ones who would not be in religious orders and would go off to a monastery separated out from the world, but who would be in the saeculum, in the world. Yes, that's what that word funded, that's the root meaning of that word. So it's simply the priests who are in the world, continue to function in that world. All right, I'm going to go on now. I'll give another chance after each of these sections here. Now I got a second kind of problem to deal with. Now I'm dealing with a young woman, a grad student in the sciences, who comes in and tells me, Father, I used to be a believer, but I'm beginning to wonder about all that. She says, I'm into science. I'm into physics and that kind of thing. And she says, the thing about science is it works. Science gets us to the moon. Science accomplishes things. You can see it. And science has got the power to straighten out this whole world of ours. We got the ability right here with technology and with scientific advances to improve the human situation, to try to free and liberate people, and to make progress in our world. And it's because it is so tangible, it begins to become one's whole way of looking at life. Now it seems as though the scientific method is the best method for solving any problem that comes up, whether it has to do with love or freedom or sexuality or whatever. Science gets answers and gets things done. So this young woman begins to take on what we call a scientific mentality. And for her, science now becomes a worldview. That is a whole philosophy of life. Total way of interpreting what human existence is all about. An overarching methodology that allows her to deal with her own experience. So, how am I going to respond now to this young woman as she comes and presents this kind of problem to me? First thing again I want to say is that the rise of science has a lot to do with our Christian understanding of things. Christianity tells people to think for themselves, tells people that the world has to be investigated, that we're put here to shape it and to control it. There's a reason why science has risen in the Western world and not in Buddhist and Hindu cultures, for example, where the world, you sort of step back from that world. You don't have the idea of shaping it so much, but of trying to maintain your own passivity in relationship to that world. So if you're hot in the West, you figure out how to build an air conditioner. If you're hot in the Eastern world, you figure out how to stand it. Different outlook. So in our modern Western world, largely shaped by the Judeo-Christian tradition, science has arisen. And therefore, we can't just throw away this child as an unwanted orphan. We have to own up to this and say that there's something fundamentally good about the rise of science itself. I want to tell her that nothing that she finds out in that world of science really worries me about religious positions and theistic positions. In other words, as she tries to tell me about evolution and her conviction that the world was evolved over billions of years, and expects me to get upset about it because the Bible says the world is created in 6 days, I have to say, no problem. No, that's the kind of thing we took last week, where the Bible teaches religious truths about the divine-human relationship and not scientific and historical truths. So for that fundamental reason, I don't fear any of the discoveries of science. Now, it's true the church has made terrible errors about this. We have the Galileo problem, in which the church had to condemn Galileo. We have the church's opposition to Darwin and the theory of evolution. We've had church opposition to the Freudian outlook, and so on. All throughout our own time, 19th, 20th century and earlier, we've seen the church reacting negatively. So my own position is that's not necessarily the way it should be. In fact, it seems to be a very unenlightened view and not in accord with the fundamentals of the gospel at all. My position would be stick with the scientific enterprise. And there really is nothing to fear from that in terms of anything particular that it will discover. I do suggest to her that the problem comes when she lets science become a religion, a worldview. That is where the problem is really created, where one begins to think that the only thing that's true is what can be empirically verified, what can be measured, counted, weighed in one way or another. That if you can't do that, it simply is not true, can't be verified, and has to be thrown out as nonsense. When I studied at Oxford, that was one of the favorite words there about the kind of work that I was trying to do by the empiricists there. The empiricists look down on all of that as talk about mystery and the eclipse of mystery. All that is nonsense, no sense, makes no sense, because it does not correspond with what can be empirically verified in one way or another. I suggest that indeed this is the real problem in what has to be counted. And therefore, I think it becomes a matter of trying to critique that scientism, when science tries to become an absolute or a worldview or a pseudo-religion. And what I suggest is that it just isn't all that great for dealing with the full range of human experience. Well, I think the science can tell us a lot about human sexual reactions, but it can't get to the mysterious core of the human relationships that found that sexual activity. When you begin to talk about freedom, I mean, as I said before, B.F. Skinner's great if you happen to be a pigeon. But if you're a human being and trying to deal with freedom as we experience it, this mysterious ability we have to take up a stance towards all of the determinisms and givens of our lives, the scientific method seems to fail badly. To be in tune with the world of art and music, to go to the El Greco exhibit and drink it in, is to know something about the deficiency of empirical analysis. It's to be in touch with a larger, richer kind of world that really that kind of rational, logical approach doesn't seem to be able to touch. And so I say when it comes to the deep and great questions of life, science finds its limitations. The other thing that the young woman really has not come in contact with, and I'm sort of surprised at that, is that science isn't doing all that great in terms of creating a better world. Science has given us pollution. The industrialization has created a fragmentation of society. We have found various ways to foul our environment. Science has given us nuclear capabilities. We can now destroy ourselves. People using the scientific, materialistic method have created some of the most dehumanizing societies around, the totalitarian societies that we know. Attempt to scientifically analyze 5-year plans, going to move ahead, create the classless society, all that. That doesn't seem to be working all that great in terms of human values. And so I would say right now, science and the scientific method isn't looking all that great as it did just a few years ago. Holes and cracks begin to appear. And people start writing books like Small is Beautiful and Let's Control Technology, and even sociologists and economists writing Not by Bread Alone Does Man Live, Robert Heilbronner's book. So you see that even within science itself, we begin to see a critique mounted. A lot of my scientific friends tell me that scientism is outmoded. That is, those people who think they're so cool and with it and on the cutting edge because they put aside this infant soul religion thing and now they're into science, really are betraying sort of a 19th century image of the whole thing. That there's movements within all the sciences now to uncover the mysterious dimension of life. Even when you listen to Carl Sagan talk and hear him interviewed and read his stuff, you see this religious dimension of life coming forward, in touch with the mystery. Einstein talked like that, about science revealing the mysterious character of this universe. And so I would suggest that the real avant-garde within the scientific world begins to break out of that reductionism, that empiricism, that materialism that often imprisoned people and kept us out of touch with the full range of human experiences, with the psyche, with emotion, with feeling, with all of the things that can't be counted in life and yet mean everything to us, like freedom and love and death and our hopes for an afterlife. On the positive side, then, again, I'm going to have to try to argue that the theistic position, that is, the being in touch with mystery and being able to name it and sensing its gracious character, is precisely what can free us to live better, to take hold of life. I want to put forward somebody to her like Teilhard de Chardin, one of the great paleontologists of the 20th century, foremost expert on the geology of China, who was also a Jesuit priest and religious visionary. Teilhard said that the believer should be most passionate about science, most interested in moving forward the human project to try to make this a better world. Teilhard found a way of integrating his scientific outlook and bent with his religious convictions. He struggled with that throughout his life, but he achieved a synthesis that seems to be beautiful and powerful and that freed him to be the best possible scientist. Well, sometimes people say to me, doesn't that religion thing sort of make you put your brains on hold? No, doesn't it make you somehow feel as though you can't be intellectually honest? And my own sense of it is just the opposite. That the theistic position which opens up everything, which relativizes any idol that you want to create in the world, whether it's science or pleasure or whatever it is, and it says, no, let's look beyond it. Let's put it into a bigger context. It's theology in the world of religion that allows us to ask the great questions. Most other disciplines have wanted to rule those out at one time or another. Can't ask that about human values. Value-free discourse in the classroom. What did all of that mean? Seems to me what it meant is the human was truncated, diminished. Important things that really mattered to us you couldn't even talk about very often in philosophy classes when they were taken over by linguistic analysis, which happened in the 20th century for us. You couldn't even talk about the great questions there. Where was the home for the great questions, for the human questions? What's it all about? Purpose, meaning? We found it in theology, in the world of religion. It was preserved there, and you could always come to that place and probe in depth what it meant to be a human being. So, I would like to say, therefore, that, again, the positive image of God, that God is the one who calls upon us to further the scientific process, calls upon us to understand our world, to shape it, to humanize it in various ways. God's the one who calls upon us to cooperate with him in creating the world and building the kingdom. Here we get a more positive notion of our God, and one that fits in, I think, with the best of the scientific outlook. Again, I'm going to pause there, and let's do our one-to-one discussion. Some people, realizing the squirm factor, might want to stand up while you do the one-to-one discussion, and we'll have a few questions after that again. Yes, Tom.
What happens when science separates something from this life? Like the example I thought of would be like a test tube baby. Well, what is the theistic response to that?
Well, you have a couple of different problems obviously involved with that, but I think you're right in a way. What science does is take the mystery out of certain areas of life. So many things, people didn't used to know why it rained, right? They thought the gods were letting holes open in the firmament or something. And so what we find out is how storms really happen, and that seems to be a good thing. So it takes the mystery out of that. So many things in life have been like that, and they all seem to me to be advances, fundamentally good things, because what they do is free us to locate the mystery in the center of things, where it really belongs. Now, your particular example of the test tube babies, of course, raises moral kinds of problems that I probably ought to save for another time. But so that very often the advance of science creates questions with us. Are we somehow dehumanizing ourselves? It's like creating atomic energy. And we have to stop and ask, is that really a good thing? What was it? Einstein again talked about that and said, you know, our moral capacities have not kept pace with our technological capacities. And that indeed is what has happened, and we are so far behind in terms of moral analysis of the modern technological things. We saw that in Father McCormick's lecture about modern medical problems, so that we have an awful lot of work to do. But in my analysis, what it does is root the mystery more deeply. I mean, it doesn't take away anything about the mystery of human life. So the mystery of human life is not contained in precisely how reproduction happens. It's contained in that core of dignity in the human being, in the fact that the human being is finally not analyzable in terms of some sort of thing that's quantified. I think that it's properly rooted. It doesn't do anything with the sense of mystery as I'm trying to describe it. Still got the question of what founds the dignity of that small human being. Whither goes that small human being? What path does it follow, and where is it heading? What's the purpose of all of that? It locates it. In fact, it seems to me it's helpful to religion. Because, see, oftentimes religion got hung up on putting the mystery in the wrong place. And that's what created many of our problems. You know, the church itself was the mystery somehow. And then when that gets sort of unpacked, and we understand the human dimension of that, for some people, poof, religion is gone. And in my mind, when you unpack all that institutional messiness, what it does is bring us face to face with the real mystery of what religion is all about. That is, what do we do with the infinite longings and finite capabilities? How is the mystery that surrounds us gracious or not? Can we trust life or not? When we die, will we fall into gracious hands or not? And what are we to say out of our own tradition about our dedication to Jesus Christ in that framework? So that's where it's properly located. And I think that's a really healthy move, something good in the long run. One more, yes. This is a book along the title out of the field of sociobiology. It's called The Selfish Gene, something like that. In other words, it's suggesting that genetically we are indeed programmed, and we're programmed to be selfish, and that we don't have much to do about it. I see it as more or less a variant of the determinism argument that we get in Skinner, that is, that we simply genetically are programmed with these longings. Seems to me the real fundamental answer to that is that even if you can show me in many ways I'm genetically determined to have longings of the heart, I still have the capability of taking up an attitude towards that. I can be mad about that, frustrated about that, try to live with it, be happy with it. That's where I think I locate my freedom, despite whatever determinism you're going to be able to point out to me. So if you can show there's a genetic base to the infinite longings, and I wouldn't be surprised if there isn't something like that, at least the way we experience them in everyday life, then I still say we have the ability to take up a position vis-a-vis that kind of determinism. We'll find that out. There's a lot of hints that way these days, aren't there? You know, they're talking about genetic relationship with alcoholism and with depression, and so we begin to find ways to deal with depression through drugs and so on. I must say that one time I felt sort of negative about that, but I've seen people who it's helped, and it makes me think that indeed perhaps there are biological bases for many of these things, but all it does again is push the mystery of freedom to where it's supposed to be. My ultimate capability of taking hold of my life. of making myself to be what I will be forever, of taking up an attitude towards all of the determinisms and givens that indeed comprise who we are as humans. That's the frame in which I would answer that. Well, I don't care what you can tell me about it genetically, I still got to figure out what to do about it. And that's where I am free, it seems to me. And that's where the human spirit is manifested. And you can see that. You know, people in very similar situations, maybe genetically programmed, you know, two people with the same deformity or the same physical problem. One rises above and one is submerged. You know, it seems to me there is that root ability to take up a position towards that. I'm going to go on now and move to the third kind of problem here. Now, I'm dealing with a young woman who comes in to me with faith problems, and this time she says things like this to me. You know, I grew up as a Catholic, and somehow I got the impression as I was going through school that it was only Catholics who were going to get to heaven. Well, I had this idea that good people got rewarded and bad people got punished. That if you went along in life and did what you were supposed to do, that God would be good to you, and you'd have good health, and your family life would go well. And that those people in the world who are suffering and living in ghettos and so on, that they're there because they were bad, somehow being properly punished by Almighty God. And now, she says to me, I'm waking up to a whole new world. None of that makes sense. I've got this good friend. I've known her all my life. She's a terrific person. She never hurt anybody. She's really good. She goes to church, and she finds out the other day that she has cancer. Now, that doesn't make any sense in this framework. And I'm meeting people who are poor and down and out and unemployed, and they seem to be really good people. And I'm finding crummy, bad people who are getting ahead and seem to be rewarded by God. This creates her problem. What is she going to do? She says, this whole thing I was taught makes no sense. My experience calls it into question. The world doesn't run like I thought it did. Now, again, how do I try to analyze that for her, to help her to make sense out of that? Well, I think that one way of saying it is that very often one's theological understanding doesn't keep pace with one's experiential level in life. So you come to college and you learn all kinds of new things, you have new experiences, the world looks different, and some people are still walking around with a grade school or high school understanding of the faith. And naturally, as they become more sophisticated and nuanced in their analysis of life and the various problems of life, this other unsophisticated analysis out of a grade school, high school understanding of the faith looks pretty paltry. It doesn't measure up. Holes can be shot in it, obviously. The root problem, it seems to me here, is that her theological understanding is simply outmoded. It is not keeping pace with her maturity level. Another way of analyzing this thing, and perhaps it is a way of nuancing the other position, is that what has happened is that her gutsy intuitions about life, about what is really true, are now out of sync with the received wisdom that she's carrying with her. What she feels in her heart no longer corresponds with what her parents taught her about God and what she learned in her CCD classes. They are now out of sync. They don't correspond. She is now in a position of oscillating. She's back and forth like this. During the week, she operates on this highly sophisticated, more intellectual level, and she goes into church on Sunday, and now she has to operate in a childlike way. She's even afraid to think that out very carefully. Her intuitions in life don't mesh anymore with the religion as she was taught it. Now, what do I do with this young woman? The first thing I tell her is that she better get into my contemporary theology class. That's where she needs to be, because one part of what she has to explore is to see what the best of theology is saying, what's the contemporary outlook, what is a more adult way of understanding the faith, so that she can have an even match-up. So she's functioning at the same level in her secular life and in her religious life. That's one of the main things that has to happen. Now, what is it that we try to do in this class, or that she needs to do? Two words come out. One is to reinterpret the dogmas, the doctrines of the faith. So, what does somebody say? Outmoded. I don't believe when you die you go to a place where you get all burned up. That doesn't make sense to me. What do I have to say? No, that doesn't make sense to me either. That's not what the doctrine of hell means. What the doctrine of hell means is that our human freedom is safeguarded. That somehow it's possible finally to say no to the powers that be. It's possible to live in self-contradiction and to go to one's death in that state. That it's possible to screen out love, even when it pursues us all throughout our lives. It's possible to fix ourselves in that condition as safe forever. Now, what happens? You might reject that, but that second explanation is clearly a more adult understanding. You know, it's more in tune with modern language in the way we tend to look at life. That's what she needs to know. She needs to hear about all the doctrines and dogmas somehow in that light, so that they don't seem strange and mythological and childish, infantile kinds of beliefs. And so I would have to go through many doctrines like that, much as the kind of thing I try to do in this class to help her. So she says purgatory. Doesn't say anything about purgatory in the Bible. That doesn't make any sense to me. And I say to her, if we didn't have purgatory, we'd have to invent it. It makes perfect sense to me. I'm not embarrassed about that doctrine at all. All it means to me is this: the common human experience that as we walk this path of life, we're not perfect. And when we get to our death, we will have not achieved perfect integration. That's for sure. That's one thing I know about me and about you. We're going to be screwed up somehow when we come to death. Something's not going to be right with us yet. We won't have integrated all aspects of our character and personality into a whole fundamental option for good. What does purgatory mean? Simply means that somehow we got to get from there to a state where we are in union with the mystery and have achieved the fulfillment of our longing. That's all purgatory points to, is that kind of fact. In a sense, the Buddhists saw the same thing. The Buddhist doctrine of reincarnation is an attempt to grapple with the same problem. That is, that one dies, one isn't perfect, one gets another shot at it somehow. It's the same human problem. In other words, purgatory is someone says, well, I don't believe you go when you die to a place and get burned up for 63 days while your friends pray for and get you out. Well, I don't believe that either. But that's not what the doctrine of purgatory says in a more sophisticated, adult way. That's not what it really means. That's not what the imagery ever meant. See, the problem is taking that kind of imagery literally, when really dogmas, doctrines are symbolic. They point to a mystery. They point to something real about the divine-human relationship. And so it is, you give me any doctrine, and I could make an attempt to reinterpret it. So what I got to do for her is to make sure she's dealing with the best. That if she's going to throw it all out, she better throw out something that's got some sophistication, some solidity to it, some thinking behind it. She may end up doing that, but she ought to be throwing out the best and not some sort of infantile approach that she had from her grade school days. Now, the second word that I see is important here is refocusing. What seems vital for an ability to appropriate the faith is to focus it on things that are important to us. Give one example of that. So perhaps she says, all the time through school, all it ever seemed they told us was, I got to save my soul. I got to get to heaven. And she says, that seems narrow to me now. I don't really dig that. That doesn't seem right. There seems more than that to me. And what do I have to do for her? I have to refocus. That is, you have to read through our scriptures, look through the tradition, and find it's not just saving one's soul. That in many places we talk about the essence of religion as being the love of neighbor. Paul spoke that way. That's the apostle. That's what it's all about. That one is to love the neighbor. You say you love God and hate the neighbor, according to John, then you're a liar. In other words, I can reread that scripture and give her a whole other interpretation focused on love of neighbor. It's in there. Called upon to do it. And what she had gotten was sort of a restricted version of all of that. And indeed, when she begins to see in the scriptures And in the tradition, all this call to charity, to do good for others, true religion, James says, take care of the widows and the orphans. She begins to see that, and she says, well, geez, that's in tune with what's in my own gut. That's what I want to do in life. I want to make the world a little better. And I have to say to her, love of neighbor is precisely the way that we love God. There isn't any other way to love God than loving the neighbor. Go to it. We're behind it. We've got an organization to help you do it. We'll give you support and help. You don't have to go someplace else. You don't have to throw out theism in order to be a humanitarian. No, it's here. The emphasis is here. The push, the thrust right there within the Christian tradition when it's refocused, in her case, on this love of neighbor. So I would have to do that with many different doctrines so that it would fit our needs today. And it can be done. So part of this course is in not only attempt to reinterpret, but to refocus our understanding of that tradition. Second way I'm going to try to answer. This is sort of hard now and difficult for me to explain, but it goes something like this. I want her to take her intuition seriously. I want her to be in touch with her gutsy feelings about life. In fact, when I talk to her, I want to start there. In fact, that's the way I always like to start in talking about religion, of which what's going on with us, what's in our psyche, in our feelings, our minds, our hearts. Let's go with that. Let's not put it aside and say that's unimportant. Then let's try to get a hold of that, try to make sense out of it, and see if we can relate that somehow to the Christian tradition that she thinks she has to throw away. Let me tell you how I would do that on a retreat with people, and I'll exemplify it in my own life for you. Go on a retreat for a weekend. The first thing I want people to do is to get in touch with their strongest negative feeling about themselves and about life. What's the main thing you think is wrong with it all? It might be someone saying, geez, I always feel unworthy and inadequate. Somebody else says, geez, the problem is I want to know so much and I can't know it all. Others say, I want to experience more love in my life. I want somebody to hold me and respond to me and try to fulfill my need for more love in my life. And I never find that, and it is so frustrating. So some people might say, what bugs me is the absurdity of the world, that there's political prisoners right now, and there's people being tortured. There's Auschwitz and Dachau and the Gulag. And that is terrible, and I can't abide that. Force people to think about that, if they can, to stay with the negative emotion and feeling, write it down. Then I ask them this, second step. How do you deal with that? Despite that, how do you get up on Monday morning? How do you function during the week? Somebody says, well, even though I feel unworthy, sometimes I overcome it and I talk to people anyway. Even though I feel inadequate, I go into work and I try to do the best I can. Somebody else says, I want to know more, so I keep trying. I'm learning a lot, and I'm trying to get into control here, my desire to know more than possible. Somebody else says, I want more love, and I'm trying to figure out, somehow I keep going without it. I don't know how I do it. I still keep functioning in life, even though I'm not getting all the tender, loving care and communication I want from my husband. I'm still in the ballgame. I'm still trying. Somebody else says, despite all of that absurdity, somehow I think it makes sense. That, I say, is what I call faith. That is a positive assessment of life that overcomes the negativity. Faith, in my mind, is always a triumph over negativity. Faith is not pie in the sky, easy answers, panaceas, nothing like that. Faith is the triumph of the positive over the negative. It's the ability to find some meaning in the midst of that absurdity, some depth in the midst of the superficialities of life. It's triumph over. Faith is always in spite of, despite the negative, I'm still here and I'm still functioning. That's what I like to call faith. And then the next step of the exercise is, now find something in the Christian tradition that will link up with that will give words to that unarticulated faith, that a story that will put it into an understandable framework. So maybe the person says, well, I read here that in the story that I feel unworthy, but I see Jesus dealt with the outcasts, the prostitutes, the tax collectors, and so on. He loved everybody. A woman taking adultery said, that's okay, let's start over here.
And when I read that, it clicks in, and I feel good. It makes sense to me. You go right down the line with all of the things that I said. The person wants more love. They're reading that God is love. God it is who will fulfill the longings of the heart. They begin to say, aha, maybe I begin to see what that means. So, trying to get a story, an image, an outlook of God to click in. You see what I've done? I've taken the intuition seriously, tried to link it in with the tradition. Now, that girl who likes the story of Jesus forgiving the woman taken in adultery, she is going to get a lot out of that. That's going to be key for her. I remember dealing with a young woman there who was having a terrible time dealing with an abortion that she had had 4 years before. It just came back like that. It's a terrible guilt kind of problem. Every time she came to see me, I'd do one main thing. I'd tell her again the story of the prodigal son. The father runs out, embraces the son, doesn't say, what'd you do that for? Why'd you run off? Why'd you take your inheritance? Prove yourself. I'll let you come back. None of that. He says, let's have a party. Runs out and I'd tell her that story over and over. Got a note from her back away saying she's doing better, relating better to her husband now, even thinking of having children now. She signed it, the prodigal daughter. The moment you see the story now clicks in. But first the story was just a story. Now it clicks in with something she knows about acceptance for herself. That's how you get faith and belief together. That's how the tradition gets a more sophisticated kind of character. Let me just run through in my own life how this works out for me. Now, the first remembered experience, according to Alfred Adler's psychology, is very important. My first remembered experience is this. We were living on one side of the street and building a home on the other side. And the foundation was down, the flooring was down. My father took me over there. And my father took me in, and then we walk on the floor. There's these gaping holes, tremendous holes there, as we're walking along on this floor. But my father is holding my hand. And as I walk along, I have this great sense of security and comfort. But while my father's holding my hand, I won't fall down into those holes. You might all try this as first remembered experience. I think some people are worse for it, some it doesn't. But the point is this. My own negative experience, my primary negative problem, in a sense, is the absurdity of the world, as represented by irrational evil inflicted by one against another. As a tourist, I went through Dachau and never forget it. It's burned into my spirit. I couldn't watch Holocaust on television. When Amnesty International sends their material out, I can only look at the front page for a second and then take out my checkbook, send my check, and throw it away. That is what touches me, the absurdity of all of that, the irrationality of that kind of thing. And yet, I find myself saying to people, it's all right, hang in there, don't give up, keep up the struggle. I find myself doing that just sort of automatically, without really thinking about it. What do I say? Someone pushes me on it, and they say, why do you think that? Well, why do you say that? And the best I can do is the story of Jesus. And I say there was one guy who took on all the darkness of life, who was deserted by his friends, and condemned unjustly as a criminal, went to his death in a horrible fashion, and yet somehow that worked out. Somehow he was raised to life. Somehow he triumphed over that. The good won out. And I say, that's the paradigmatic story. That's the model that helps me to explain my spontaneous statement that indeed it does make sense. So, what I try to do is, one way or another, put all of that together. I'm going to take just a short break here. Like a Santa Claus, that if you did good things, he would give you good things in return. Some people think of God like a divine bookkeeper, somebody who's up there keeping pluses and minuses, and you better get more pluses by the time it's time to check out of this life, or you're in big trouble. So we have this imagery of God. What we need, it seems, a vast variety of images that appeal to us and help to fill out this picture, always realizing that no one image can capture the absolute mystery that surrounds us. So you see here in the syllabus a lot of different images of God. We need paternal images, for sure, But there's some people, who can't deal with that. I was talking to one person, he says, and every time they say God is a loving father to me, he says, I just want to tighten up in the stomach. Because he had a terrible relationship with his father. Wonderful relationship with his mother. What he needed was maternal imagery of God. He needed to hear about God as our mother, the loving one who nourishes and brings forth, who continues to nurture as we go along in life. Life-giving spirit for us. And so perhaps we have a lot of different kinds of imagery here. The center that out of which everything flows and back to which everything comes. One of Karl Rahner's favorite ones, the incomprehensible one, the inexhaustible one, favorite words for who God is. Karl Barth likes to talk about God as the wholly other, the one that's up above, beyond all of us, in judgment upon the world. Paul Tillich liked to talk about God as ultimate concern, as that which you had to grab hold of, which you just couldn't slough off, that pulled forth the best things that were inside of us. The holy mystery, the future which allures and draws us, power, ground of being, that's another one taken from Paul Tillich, and the one that Jesus popularized and initiated in the world's religious history, one of the great breakthroughs, he called God Abba, which in his own language was the endearing term that a youngster would use for his father. Abba, Papa, Daddy. Unheard of. We're absolutely sure, as we'll take next week, that Jesus said Abba, because he had no precedence for it any place in his culture and his religious heritage. Breakthrough, that God was so close, so tender, that you could address him in that most familiar way, Papa or Daddy. Two of the images I like best are source and goal. God is the source of all that we have, all of our energy, all of our love, all of our knowledge, our very being. And God is the goal of our striving. God's the one towards whom we tend, the only possible one that can fulfill the longings of the heart. Well, everyone has to find their own imagery. You got hundreds of images scattered throughout the Bible. The whirlwind, the gentle breeze, the potter takes the clay and molds it. The shepherd, the king, all these various images. And what's important is to find one that we like, that fits in. One of the experiments I do with people is to have them recall a most important encounter with another person, a very significant one. Probe it, think about it, and at the end of it, try to come up with an image for the mysterious dimension of that encounter. Often a very good way to find out who God really is for us. So we're not just using words that we got from a tradition, but make sense to us. And in this whole image thing, what's important is to somehow reinterpret the doctrine of the Trinity. If we just repeat the traditional doctrine of the Trinity, we'd probably fall into heresy. Most people, and little kids as they're growing up, if you say there's three persons in one God, what do they think? There's three gods somehow joined together. And of course, what we in our Judeo-Christian tradition have always insisted on is there's one God. So we have to reinterpret. You can't just tell kids or the next generation there's three persons in one God, because the word person has changed meaning throughout history from what it was in the 3rd and 4th century in the Greek, apostasis, and now it means an individuated center of consciousness. So you say three persons, they got three consciousnesses dealing here, three persons. So we have to say it a different way. And one of my own favorite ways of talking about it is this, to look at our own experience. And as we look at our experience, we say there's a way in which we know we didn't originate ourselves. We come from a power greater than ourselves. There's a source to it all. And we call the one God, insofar as that God is the source of it all, Father. And we say that one among us was the greatest. One among us was so truly close to God that he was God personally in our midst. We say that God pitched his tent on this earth of ours, and we say the one God, insofar as he was historically manifested, we call that one God the Son, or the Word, or the Logos. And as we look at our experience, we find a gift dimension. We find something there that's unbidden, a good idea, an insight to help somebody, inspiration to do some good. And what do we say? The one God as the gift dimension of life we denominate as the Spirit, or the Holy Ghost, the Holy Spirit, the third person of the Trinity. You see, what I've tried to do is relate that Trinitarian doctrine to what you and I know. We didn't bring ourselves into this world, and there's one walking around who's a good example on how to live, and there is often a gift dimension to life. And that's what we relate to the Trinity then. And we say that that's something of the way God is in himself, actually. That the one God has this threefold mode of relating to us. And so that we try to preserve that doctrine of the three persons in one God by reinterpreting it in that way. What I've just said would produce a great debate in theological circles, and some of you may recognize in what I said certain dangerous tendencies. And yet I feel that it is a better way of speaking about it than merely repeating the standard catechism approach to the Trinity. Finally, in this section about improving our imagery of God is that you see in contemporary theology great emphasis on saying that God is within. Augustine once said God is closer to us than we are to ourselves. Contemporary theology likes to bring God into history, into the world, into our experience. It is to speak of God as immanent within the process, so that the new metaphor used in contemporary theology is not height, not looking up for God, looking into the sky like Fiddler on the Roof, but the new dimension is depth, looking within, looking down more deeply into what it means to be human, confident that as we probe the human, get beneath the surface, we arrive at a ground, a firm foundation, a source, a goal that we denominate as God. Contemporary theology has to be careful not to lose the transcendence of God. Many people feel this. They come to updated Catholic liturgies and somehow they feel there's something missing here. The mystery dimension is too informal, it's too loose, it's too human in a way. And some people will feel it. Where's the transcendence? Where's the Gothic cathedral? Go to the El Greco exhibit and you'll get a good sense of transcendence. All the elongated figures, all of the supernatural world up there, angels up there, light up above. There's transcendence. You get it when you walk into a great cathedral, the upward movement of the Spirit. And you can't lose that. And yet the contemporary theologian likes to stress the immanence. So whatever side you're on, if you're into transcendence, you don't want God to be so wholly other, so up there that you can no longer relate to him. That's one of the geniuses of El Greco. I don't know why I'm on that, except I saw the exhibit not long ago, and it's on my mind, and I want to write an article about it and so on. But the idea is that that light up there suffuses the creatures down here. El Greco found a way to interpenetrate those two worlds of transcendence and immanence, and that's why he's great, and a lot of the other people who painted that two-decker world are not, at least the way I end up seeing it. Well, anyway, the two things have to go together, transcendence or immanence. But by and large, we're going to come down on one side or the other as we go along. Contemporary theology stresses the immanent. Well, you just had a break, so I think we can go on. One question. Anybody got a question? Yes. Yes, the Word, the Logos, we read it in John's Gospel, the Word became flesh. Well, you could try to analyze that in many different ways. One of the things we think that John got that idea from the wisdom literature of his own tradition, where it says that wisdom played with God when he created the world. The Old Testament, the Hebrew Scriptures, the Tanakh, sort of personified wisdom. And there's a strong feeling among Scripture scholars that John got the idea of the Word from that. He personified the other being with God and talked about it as logos. That's the Greek word that he used, which we translate word, which somehow meant a personified being, that the Word which came down from heaven was spoken by the Father and spoken into our history. I think that is, the biblical derivation of it. Well, I mean, there's been psychological interpretations of that throughout history. Augustine attempted one, that the Father spoke the Word, and then the Word and responded to the Father, and they produced the Spirit. I don't find that very satisfying or helpful. I think that it is better to talk about the fact that the one God speaks the Word into history. comes so close, so personally near, that he walks among us as a man. The Word is spoken, and the Word as spoken comes to be a human being. I prefer that kind of approach. There is a lot of fuzzy areas, but I would suggest that as a frame for beginning to deal with it. Let me go on. Now I'm dealing with a young man who comes in to see me and says, Father, I have been plagued with guilt feelings forever. It came from my mother, I know it. She was always on my back and telling me I was doing things wrong, and I'm carrying that with me, and it's all bound up with religion and that nun who threw me up against the wall and the priest who yelled at me in the confessional, and I'm carrying this baggage, man, and I don't want it anymore. And as soon as I can get rid of that baggage, I'm going to be free, and what I got to do is get rid of this belief in God, this whole theistic position, this whole religion thing, so that I can live a fully human life, so I can be at ease for once in myself and not be walking around with this heavy black cloud that I call guilt. Well, this young man, I think, is popularizing, in a way, the classic objections to faith in the 19th and 20th century. Classic objections have said that indeed belief is dehumanizing. That if you are a believer, you'll be less human than you ought to be. You'll remain in a childish kind of state. It runs right through the great critics of the 19th, 20th century. So we get from Marx the idea that belief in God is like an opiate. It's like a drug. It puts your mind on heaven and keeps you from the real human task of creating a better society here on the earth. What did Nietzsche say? And also in the 19th century, Nietzsche said that as long as there was God around, we would never create our own values. We'd never take hold. We would just be acting like a puppet. You know, Nietzsche's famous parable of the madman. Some of you know that. The madman comes into the marketplace where there's a lot of atheists. He says, well, where is God? They laugh and he says, what's wrong? Did you lose him? And he says, no, I didn't lose him. I'll tell you where he is. He's dead. God is dead. And we have killed him. And now the sun, the earth is unchained from the sun. Now we don't know up from down. And who will indeed wipe this blood from our hands? Great parable of the madman in Nietzsche. Nietzsche saw himself as the prophet of the 19th century. The meaning of the parable is something like this, I think. That is, that all the absolutes in the modern world are crumbling. All the things that held us in proper position are gone, and the last absolute that goes is God. And when God goes, when God is dead, then we're in a position to be the Ubermensch, the super people, who will indeed create our own values. And so Nietzsche thought that's what would happen. Sure, Hitler got his idea of the super race from Nietzsche. So Nietzsche said, once God is dead, now we're really free. We can create our own values, and now we're going to separate those who really got it from those who don't. And those who've got it will take hold and make something out of themselves. Religion is dehumanizing. Theism, when God is alive for people, they are in an infantile state just accepting values. The real super people will create their own. Freud, what's the title of his book about this? One of them, Future of an Illusion. For Freud, religion was an illusion. It was a projection out of need. So that we need a father figure to hold us together, and so the human psyche projects that out and says that indeed we somehow have to have this God to keep us going. Freud felt that theism again would keep us childish all our lives. For him, religion was a compulsive neurosis, something that people can repeat over and over so that they will magically ward off the powers of evil that are in the world. Religion and belief in God is nothing but a projection out of the human psyche. Sartre, to take one final example here, Sartre says that man is a useless passion. That as long as there's a God around for us, that we'll never be free. If there's a God who knows everything and who is all-powerful, then we cannot be free. We must be acting merely as puppets. And what we've got to do is to get rid of that God figure so we can act in a truly free way. Those are the great classic critics. What do they have in common? Religion is dehumanizing. Theism keeps us in an infantile state in various ways. It's the same objection that the young man tells me when he says, I'm riding around with these guilt feelings precisely because of my religious training. Now, how are we going to try to respond to this kind of objection? What am I going to say about this? First thing is I have to admit a great deal of that. There's much in the classic criticism that's true. Religion has been an opiate for many people. It was preached to the slaves in the United States that way. Just obey your masters and you'll get to heaven someday. It was used for that purpose. Nietzsche's right. Many people never get around to an adult appropriation of values. They just do what the culture says, follow peer pressure, go along. That's true in many ways. Religion has often fostered that. Freud is certainly correct in saying there's an element of projection in our image of God. Much of it does arise out of our own psyche, our own needs, and so on. And Sartre's right, I think, that many believers have not been as free, as vibrant, as committed kind of people as they ought to be. But where they fail is their claim that this is essentially and necessarily true, that religion has to do this. And I'd say that is patently absurd. Because as a matter of fact, empirically, religion, theism, has often freed people to be terrific individuals. So we think of St. Francis of Assisi, whose feast we celebrated not long ago, who many people find to be a tremendous individual, at ease with nature, knowing how to live a simple life, relating well to people. We think of Mohandas Gandhi, functioning in the 20th century out of a Hindu religious tradition and liberating a whole continent, doing more than almost anybody else in the modern world for social justice, working out of a religious framework. We look at the way Martin Luther King called upon the symbols of his own tradition and the national heritage to further the civil rights movement. We think of Cesar Chavez working for the migrant farm workers. We think of Dag Hammarskjöld, one of the most respected people in the 20th century in terms of trying to work out international problems. Many people have a soft spot in their heart for John the 23rd, a very humane individual working out of the Catholic tradition. Think of Dorothy Day, who people look up to as a great social reformer. Those people's very lives belie the statement that religion is necessarily dehumanizing. And I don't have to just look at those people. All I have to do is look at my own mother and father, just like a lot of you people can, and see people who were nourished by religious tradition and sacrificed for their kids and put the bread on the table, struggled to raise their kids, and so on. You know, you just look around you, and it's patently false that religion is necessarily dehumanizing and creates immaturity. For some people, it's functioned in the opposite way. It has liberated, made them more involved, helped them to live a better life. Now, if I can try to get at this in more careful way with each one of these critics, if I try to respond to Marx, it's interesting. There's a lot of Christian Marxist dialogue that's gone on since the Second Vatican Council, which ended in 1965. Marxists and Christians getting together. There's a lot of this going on in Latin America now. There's a lot of theologians down there who use the categories of Marx to understand what's going on in South America and Latin America. There is a Christian type of Marxism today, which is interesting. Marx, in his early years, was a great humanist. In the age 26, he wrote those economic and philosophic fragments. Wonderful humanism in there. Marx says, what would the world be like when we really had it together? Everyone would enjoy their work. There would be no competition. People would live in harmony. In the morning you would work, the afternoon you would hunt, and in the evening you'd read together and discuss. Beautiful kind of world. Marx was a humanist in many ways. Much of what he had to say can be used. But what it forces the Christians to do is to go back and refocus and say, wait a second, our scriptures tell us we better build a better earth. So we're supposed to transform this world, that love of God and love of neighbor go together. So we're supposed to help spread the kingdom, which is a kingdom of shalom and justice and peace. That's what we're called upon to do, that we can find God in the liberation movement. Where should the church be? The church should be trying to help those who are oppressed and needy and hurting in one way or another. Yeah, by refocusing liberation theology and dialogue with Marxism helps us to see that's in there. I think Marx is simply not correct when he says that it has to divert us from social justice. Did it divert Martin Luther King, Cesar Chavez, Dorothy Day, Mohandas Gandhi? No, it was the inspiration for them. And it's not that they were idiosyncratic somehow, that they didn't fit into the overall frame. No, they found their inspiration right in that tradition. And what do I want to try to say to Freud? Again, I have to admit a lot of the Freudian critique. Some people, religion is compulsive. They go to, I think sometimes some young people got to not go to Mass for a while just to find out they won't get hit by lightning if they don't go. That seems to be a necessary part of growing up somehow, to find this out, to get freed from some sort of compulsive, neurotic behavior. But Freud's idea that religion is necessarily nothing more than a projection really is unsophisticated. Freud didn't really try to answer the deep philosophic, theological problems that exist. He no more disproved theism than we can prove it like 2 + 2 is 4. Yeah, there is projection. And one of the problems I suggest in Freud here is that he had this really poor notion of human nature. There's this boiling cauldron inside of us just ready to erupt. And you almost need culture and social constraints so that it doesn't break loose and just cause us to do all kind of irrational things. And yet, the Freudian therapists think that they can take you and make you all right, despite that boiling cauldron. There's a strange combination of optimism about, through this therapy that they can fix us up, and on the other hand, this pessimistic notion of human nature derived from Freud that indeed the id is all controlling, the id is just ready to burst forth somehow and to mess us up. Now, there's projection, but you're still back to the same question. Is there something we're projecting on? Is there a fulfillment for the longings of our heart? And I say if there isn't, indeed the world is absurd. Indeed, the world does make no sense. And I have to ask Sigmund why he kept getting up in the morning, why he kept writing those books, why he went through his terrible disease late in his life and kept functioning, if the whole of all of that is absurd. The kind of, we call that in logic, the argument known as retorsion, throwing back the argument where actions belie explicit statements. Anyway, some attempts to say something about Freud. And in response to Nietzsche and Sartre about freedom, I would say this. True freedom, I think, is a function of intimacy and closeness and not distance. Their idea is somehow you got to distance yourself in order to be free. We got that in our culture with the Marlboro man, I talked about, out on the horse. He's the guy who's free, no ties and a tattoo. He can get away. That's our notion of freedom. But I would suggest that the best of our experience is different from that. The best of our experience says freedom is a function of intimacy and closeness. When do we feel freest? When some other person accepts us as we are. When some other person says it's all right that you have this fault or foible. It's all, I love you anyway, despite this strange behavior that you're just going through. It's when the person tells us that we can be our better self and try to accomplish and try to move forward with our gifts and talents. That's when we feel freest, when we feel liberated, when we're accepted as we are by another human being. What am I saying? Freedom is a function of intimacy, of closeness, and of love, and not of distance. Transferred into this realm, I would say the freest person, therefore, who ever lived was Jesus of Nazareth, precisely because he was the closest to God. I would suggest that our experience tells us that the closer we are to God, the freer we will be. Flannery O'Connor once said that the only way she could write her short stories was because she was a Catholic. Being a Catholic didn't restrict her from her creativity. It freed her. It gave her parameters. It gave her a framework within which to work, which allowed her creativity to go and to move onward. And I think that's how it is with God. The closeness with God precisely is what frees us. Part of the way I would try to respond, I suppose, to Nietzsche and Sartre. So, what we have here, I'm saying there is no dichotomy between theism and humanism. There is an authentic theistic humanism. That is, a humanism that's open-ended, a humanism that understands that, indeed, we can't make an idol out of anything in this life, that there is a God who calls us to develop our talents and our gifts and to become all that we ever could be. There's a spirit around that tells us we got more potential than we ever realized. So often I find myself just telling people, you can do that. You can do it. Don't sell yourself short. You've got powers you haven't thought of yet. The Spirit of God calls us forward to that. I think that most of us haven't even touched our potential. And the belief in God suggests that there's a whole world out there to be shaped. So, some attempts to respond to this problem of the dehumanizing charge. Let's do our one-to-one discussion for a minute and perhaps we'll see if there's any questions. Somebody during the break reminded me of that great piece of graffiti. You've seen it? Nietzsche is dead, signed God. There's something about the mortality of our human situation. Do we have any questions at this point? Yes? Well, we might save that. Maybe another time. You're going to ask me after class. All right. I'm going to launch forward. One final large thrust here. So, yes, try to, as Bear Bryant said, suck in your guts. Try to get the last ounce of energy left here to stay with me. Great theologian, Bear Bryant. Bronner, Flanagan, K.R., and the Bear. You know. Now we have the situation where a person comes in to me and says, my good mother, who's still got 3 kids to raise, who are still young ones, is now dying of cancer. Never did anything wrong in her life, she had all these good things to do. What about this? Now we're facing the problem of evil in a lot of its monstrous kind of form. You can extend that and think of Hiroshima and Nagasaki and the Gulag and Dachau and Auschwitz, as we suggested before. We also find it at a very personal level when some people are so depressed they can't function, and when marriages break up, and when people die before their time, etc. The problem of evil really is the most difficult one for theism. It represents the great challenge. It's put in this form of what we call theodicy. That is, how can there be a good God when 2/3 of the world is going to bed hungry at night? How can there be a good God who's all-powerful when there's all this evil in the world? That's fundamentally, I would say, the way the argument comes to many people. Now, one dare not speak glibly about that. Maybe I just need to sit with this person and let them cry for a while about the impending death of their mother. There aren't any simple or easy answers here, and that's why it's the most difficult of all of the challenges to theism. Now, throughout the history of the world, we have seen various attempts to answer that. One by St. Augustine was something like this. Augustine said, we have a very limited perspective, and from this perspective we see the earthquake and it killed so many people, and we say, this is terrible, how can there be a good God? But if we saw it from the higher perspective that God occupies, we would see that it fits into some grand plan. Well, many people use that yet. I notice that. Very good people who will say, I don't understand this, but somehow it makes sense. Somehow God had a purpose in taking my mother in this occasion. Somehow God has a reason for all this that I don't understand and that I have to accept. I think that's the simple way of the Augustinian explanation working itself out in life. Now, many people find that answer to be not so satisfying today because they envision a God who's up there sort of playing games with us and sort of saying, well, see how much he can take now. I'm going to put this new burden on him and see if he can stand it, he's got enough character or not. In other words, it's almost like God is allowing evil or permitting evil or even maybe causing evil as a test to us. And for many people, that is a repugnant idea. And I must say, for myself, that would be a most difficult image or notion of God to ever accept. Therefore, what many moderns are doing is trying to reinterpret the problem. They're suggesting something like this, that God is one who's trying to bring the creation back to himself. God has only good purposes for us. God is the one who's trying to straighten the world out, trying to make it better and overcome evil, but he's blocked in doing that. Blocked by what? Our own hardness of heart, our inability to cooperate, our failure to try to create the kingdom along with God. He's blocked by our own selfishness. So that creates a little different kind of picture in a way. Now, Teilhard de Chardin talked about it like this. He said, if we think of the world in static terms, like God created it by putting flowers in a vase, we'd have to ask ourselves, when the flowers are askew, well, why did he put them in there like that? Why did he put them all in right? But Teilhard says the world isn't like that. It's not static like that. In the modern world, we're out on the top deck. Those of us who are on the top deck think of the world as evolving. He says it's more like God planted a tree, and this living thing has to grope its way forward. It gropes its way towards its final shape or its fulfillment. And when something gropes, it makes mistakes. It runs into things. We get crooked limbs. We get something that isn't perfectly symmetrical. Yet this organic growing thing is moving towards its fulfillment. And he thinks that's more how the world is. That evil is a statistical necessity in a material, evolving world. You can't have a world that's material that won't break apart and fall apart. You can't have bodies that won't wear out and be diseased and finally die. And if people are free, sin will be statistically inevitable. Sooner or later, people are going to blow it. Sooner or later, people are going to use their freedom to say no. And in this picture, God leaves us so free that we are free enough to sin, to live in self-contradiction, to damn ourselves forever. So Teilhar's fundamental answer is there's a good God trying to bring the world forward, trying to help us, is in the struggle next to us, as he shows in the incarnation and as Jesus carries the cross with us, and yet blocked by our own hardness of heart. That suggests as a response that what people need to do is to cooperate with the good God in trying to create a better world and that we would overcome. A lot of that does seem obvious. A lot of the problems in the world is because greedy people won't share what they have, because people want to make wars. Why are those people suffering in Lebanon now? Because of the war. Why are so many people starving? Because we haven't used our brains to figure out a distribution system to get it to them. Because we have perhaps corporate structures that take over farmland and grow bananas in Jamaica and ship them to us so people there can't grow their own food for their own purposes. Some people disagree with that analysis, but some people recognize that as Francis Lapay's argument about why we have world hunger. But be that as it may, in some ways you can see that the evils in the world do result from human selfishness and greed and hard-heartedness and lack of intelligence. My man Karl Rahner has a little different approach to it. His attitude is evil is finally a mystery. There aren't any good whys. There's nothing good about why that I can tell this young person contemplating the mother's death from cancer. There's no good why. Jesus broke the connection with why. The apostle said, why is this man blind? Did he sin or his parents? And Jesus said, neither one. Broke the connection. Neither one. This is a mysterious business, he said. It's got to do with the glory of God. No good causal explanation of this. Rahner says we ought to go with that. The ultimate problem is mysterious, and the real question is not why, but how. How do we cope? How do we keep going? How do we keep our spirits up? How do we reach out to others when we're feeling sorry for ourselves? How do we work on world hunger? How do we overcome the racial problems in our country? How is the real effort. That's where it's got to be. There's a lot of wisdom in that. Many people find it unsatisfying intellectually, but a lot of us would be a lot better off if we didn't feel sorry for ourselves and got on with the question of how. A lot of us would be doing better if we were working to overcome the problems, I think. The whole idea of original sin comes in here. There's really two major notions of original sin in the history of Christianity. One is from Augustine. A lot of times what I say about Augustine is negative. Augustine messed up our heads totally on sexuality. He's the reason that we got all these unhealthy notions about human sexuality. Augustine thought it was at least a venial sin for most married couples to have intercourse. He was the original playboy, had a mistress, illegitimate child, and so on. I don't think he really ever got over that or got his head straight on it. Anyway, Augustine, I think he's great, and I often like his pithy quotes, but in many ways I think he messes up. But he popularized this idea of taking almost literally, in a sense, the story of the Garden of Eden. For him, people were in this perfect state, and in this perfect state, they somehow rebelled against God, committed this horrible sin, were punished, and sort of have been in this state of being punished ever since. Now, there was another thinker early on in Christianity who had another outlook on this, another way of approaching this problem of original sin. And his view was more like this, that the first humans in the evolutionary process were very childlike and primitive. And naturally, they blew it. To be expected. But God's reaction was not terrible wrath, but I'll bring them back to myself. I'll educate them gradually. I'll teach the human race how to live right. I'll bring them to final fulfillment someday. A whole other way of thinking about the original sin. One I think that probably strikes more responsive chords to us. Really, the old idea, I think, of a perfect couple living in a high state makes no sense in a Darwinian or evolutionary viewpoint of the world. We would expect the first humans to be primitive and childlike. And so I think this other viewpoint perhaps represents a more contemporary understanding. Somehow it doesn't make God look like a terrible ogre. You understand? God now is more fatherly, more maternal, more trying to help us to move forward. Okay, that's something of the way perhaps that I would try to respond to this young person dealing with the mother and cancer. No easy answers, no glib talk. I think what we finally say is in the Christian framework is that God came among us, took on all the suffering, carried the cross, knew the disappointment of friends who ran away at the crucial moment, took it all on and transformed it, rose above it, showing that evil is not the final word, that the good wins out over the evil, and that it's possible to move onward and become closer to God and to transform that evil somehow into good. Resurrection follows the cross. Easter follows Good Friday. That's what we Christians have to say perhaps as a final kind of word on this problem of evil. And now, if I could ask your indulgence for a moment, I'd like to finish up this final section very briefly. I have just a couple minutes to do that. And that is to do with the proofs for God's existence. There was a time when people thought they could prove God existed like 2 plus 2 is 4. They thought it was easy. We had all different kinds of arguments, and Thomas Aquinas and so on. And when I was in the seminary, they taught me how to prove to anybody, anytime, that God existed and no doubt about it. But what has happened in the modern world is that philosophers have come forth, theologians have challenged these proofs, and I would say among contemporary theologians today, we sort of have a consensus that there's no one proof that's final or conclusive, and there's no grouping of proofs that carries that kind of final weight. Few exceptions to this. Mortimer Adler, you might read some of his stuff, claims differently, but I'd say the dominant philosophic theological movement is in that direction. So, and even if we could try to prove it, most people couldn't understand it anyway. I made an attempt at it in the last chapter of my book. Try that for bedtime reading, and that'll put you to sleep for sure. But somehow I think it's more like this, that we try to vindicate the theistic position. And we start out with saying about our infinite longings. We want more love in our lives. Our hearts are restless. The question mark is right there to my heart. And the real question for us becomes, is there ever a fulfillment or not, or am I going to be disappointed forever? That seems to be the question. Is the life meaningful or absurd? Theism says it's meaningful because the longings of the heart will be satisfied. If we think there's no afterlife, we think there's no God, if the world is self-contained, then I would say it is indeed absurd to have 2/3 of the world hungry right now, to have Auschwitz. That seems to me to be absurd. Now, when John Paul Sartre says, yes, the world is absurd, man is a useless passion, we want to be God and we can't do it, then I have to say to that, his actions belied his words. I have to ask Sartre, why did he get up in the morning? Why did he write those books? Why was he a member of the resistance? Why did he try to humanize the world? And I think that his actions suggest that, indeed, there is a meaning in there, even though his words and his arguments deny it. To me, the great proof of belief in God is getting up in the morning. Anyone who gets up in the morning, I think, believes in God. It's an affirmation of life. It's saying somehow this whole crummy mess makes sense. That despite the angst or anxiety that's assailing me today, it has some sort of final meaning. And those people who say it doesn't, I got to ask, what motivates you? Why do you get up in the morning? Seems to me those are really the choices. You know, there was an article printed that claimed that Sartre on his deathbed talked in this more positive theistic vein. I saw the article. I haven't been able to verify it from any other source, but that really would be interesting. You know, Sartre once said that being an atheist is a lifetime occupation. You've got to work at it every minute because theism will sneak back in. Maybe it did. Maybe it did on his deathbed. I understand Simon was very upset about all this and felt that he was put upon and his words were twisted and so on. But anyway, whatever the truth may be, that's not ultimately important here. But what I'm saying is you can't prove it like 2 plus 2 is 4, but I think you can vindicate it. You can tilt it. Seems to me you can show that in a certain way that there is a probability to belief in God. And I fall back on the pragmatic argument. What's going to help me live better, understand life better? What's the most coherent theory I have for dealing with freedom and love and death and the possibility of the fulfillment of my hope? That's the kind of arguments I would use, pragmatic, coherence type arguments. And to me, there is a movement in that direction towards theism. Well, all the words come and go, and you get back to the simple statement that what theism means is this: the mystery that surrounds me, that I'm oriented to, is gracious. It's trustworthy. I can trust life. Becomes the simplest theistic creed. I can trust life because the mystery is benign that surrounds me. Next week we're going to talk about Christology. I think in many ways it's the most interesting class out of the 7. The question is, who is Jesus? We'll be talking about the center point of what Christianity is all about. So if you want to bring a friend just for next class who's sort of into Christian type things like that, feel free to do so. We'll see you next week.